Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Marking the Centennial, the Origins of the Borough of Bryn Athyn, a presentation by Brian Henderson. My name is Amanda Lichtenstein, and I am the Alumni Relations Manager at Bryn Athyn College. Thank you for joining us today. If, during tonight's presentation, you experience technical difficulties, please email me at amanda.lichtenstein@brynathyn.edu. Additionally, to submit a question at the end of the presentation, you may use the Q&A feature of this app or email me. Again, my email address is amanda.lichtenstein@brynathyn.edu. It is now my pleasure to introduce Brian Henderson. Brian is an alumnus of the college, having earned his associate degree in 1989. Brian then earned his BA in history from Penn State and then his master's in history from Villanova. Brian returned to Bryn Athyn College in 1993, where he taught history for 20 years and served as Dean of Students for 9 years. Brian now serves as the director of Glencairn Museum. Thank you for joining us today, Brian.
Thank you very much, Amanda. I wanted to start by thanking you for handling all these logistics, and I also want to thank Brian Blair for inviting me to speak with all of you this evening. I'd also like to offer my apologies. This is the first time for me giving a presentation in front of a wholly virtual audience, so please forgive any stumbles. And I guess the one advantage is if you all nod off, unlike teaching class, I won't be able to tell. So my plan tonight is to talk for about 30 to 40 minutes and then allow time for question and answer. All right, so I guess we'll just get started. And I wanted to start with this quote: "Bryn Athyn is a growing college town." Now, many of you as members of the extended Bryn Athyn College community, I suppose, would well agree with this statement, reflecting on how the college has grown over the last several years, more than doubling enrollment, adding recent additions to the physical campus, such as Brickman Center, Deering Center, the cottages, the suites, a new athletic field, 2 new residence halls are rising from the ground as we speak, added several new academic programs. But really, I want to reflect on who actually wrote this quote. I actually came across this quote as I was preparing for this talk, and believe it or not, this quote was written by none other than Raymond Pitcairn, and he wrote it 100 years ago in his 1915 legal brief in support of the petition filed for the incorporation of Bryn Athyn Borough. As many of you are aware, February 8th, a little less than 3 months ago, marked the 100th anniversary of the incorporation of Bryn Athyn into a municipal borough. And I thought it might be interesting to take a look at some of the statistics here. Some of these flash by on this last slide, but if you look at the most recent demographic statistics, I have it from 5 years ago, 6 years ago, 2010. But if you see, Bryn Athyn today makes up roughly about 2 square miles. Back when Bryn Athyn became a borough, it's about 7.3, so 3/4 of a square mile. Look at the population today, a little under 1,400, only 400-ish back then. But look at the number of housing units, 543 today to only 62. And so it's really an amazing story when you think back to the founding of this borough. But the 100th year anniversary, which was really a demarcation of Bryn Athyn becoming a municipal borough, is not just the marking of a beginning. It's actually the culmination of a dream that had begun 42 years earlier. So what I hope to do this evening is to recall a little bit of the dream and a little bit of the story of how the borough came to be. First, as a religious settlement with education as its primary motivating goal, as it rested within Moreland Township, and then as its own incorporated borough. In doing so, I hope to address a couple of questions. First, why did the academy and the church move from Philadelphia out into the country? Second, what were their goals and dreams for the community? Was Bryn Athyn always the obvious choice for its location? Fourth, why did they believe it was so important for this new community to become a separate, distinct borough? And lastly, if we have an opportunity, maybe to reflect on a little bit about why it's useful for us today, 100 years later, to reflect on this story. But to begin to answer the questions, I think it's important to recognize, first and foremost, the primary role that education and the vision for the academy played in the formation and incorporation of Bryn Athyn. For this reason, I think it's useful to briefly review the planting of those educational seeds 42 years before the borough was legally incorporated. So maybe we should begin by reading John Pitcairn's diary from 1874. Monday, January 12th, Mr. Benaid, Frank Ballou, Walter C. Childs, and myself lunched together today. Organized new church club by electing Mr. Benaid president, W.C. Childs secretary, and Frank Ballou treasurer. During this lunchtime conversation, a suggestion was made, quote, that those present form an organization there and then in order to begin a propaganda by means of the printed page for a reformatory movement in the new church. Forming the new church club here at the Atlantic Garden Restaurant on Diamond Street in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in 1874, these four men believed that the convention, the branch of the church to which they all belonged, that the convention's missionary efforts were not bearing enough fruit. They believed that the clergy, in the words of Walter Childs, quote, should concentrate their efforts upon instructing their own people and keeping their children in the church, unquote. 2 days after this lunch meeting, John Pitcairn wrote this check here for $500 to support the cause. He later noted that January 14th, 1874 was, quote, the day in which the academy first became an ultimate body, unquote. It was on June 19th, 2 years later in 1876, that these and 8 other men met again, but this time in Philadelphia, in the home of Dr. Francis Barricky, to formally establish the Academy of the New Church. The next year, on November 3rd, 1877, less than 4 years after the founding of their new church club over lunch, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania granted the Academy of the New Church its formal charter. That year, the Academy developed a theological school for training ministers. The following year, in 1878, it formed the college, now Bryn Athyn College, and also a museum. A boys' school and a girls' school were then formed over the next several years. The schools were initially located in the lower floor of the church building on Cherry Street, right here on the left. And the upper floor, shown here on the right, was used for worship for their newly formed Philadelphia branch of the General Church of the Advent, an international new church organization. Just love this quote by Henry Schill. He was a member of the congregation, or actually it's a quote about Henry Schill, who provided housing for the students. It was said he treated them, quote, more like guests than boarders. And the quote by Mary Bostock goes on to say, quote, he visited and talked with them, gave them a settled home-like feeling, as well as stimulating talk on all kinds of subjects, and always looking to the writings for guidance. Often there was a glass of beer and a bite to stimulate these friendly discussions, unquote. Sorry, we got a little delay in my slides here. All right. Well before Bryn Athyn was established, however, members of this Advent Society enjoyed taking train rides out from Philadelphia out into the country to picnic to escape the summer heat of the city. According to community tradition, their destination was Alnwick Grove. Now, I'm sure many of you have heard of Alnwick Grove, but here it is on the map here. This is an 1886 map. You can see it here on the left. And Alnwick Grove was a park that ran along the Pennypack Creek just south of what is now Bryn Athyn Post Office, up here in the top left-hand corner, and what was the Huntington Valley station and stop down here at the bottom. This postcard labeled Alnwick Grove, PA, isn't actually dated, but I think it provides a compelling image of what the Pennypack Creek and the grounds beside it looked like at the time. when the church members were coming out here to picnic in the countryside. According to an 1879 newspaper article, the park, which was created by the railroad, in fact, featured, quote, a commodious pavilion for dancing purposes and a large number of tables and seats for the convenience of excursionists and picnic parties. Just as an aside, I recently learned that the railroad line had just been completed the previous year, and that it makes sense to me why the railroad was sort of providing these parks and encouraging these excursions as a way to try to promote the use of this new railroad line. It's unknown exactly when or how often the members of the Advent Society actually took the train out to Alnwick Grove, but it is clear that the Academy members enjoyed picnicking here at Alnwick Grove. This photograph, although it's taken 20 years later in 1899, shows some residents picnicking at one of these tables in the park. An early church member, Frida Pendleton, recalled the pavilion there much later in her life. This quote comes from a letter she wrote in 1949. Quote, I can remember that there was a good-sized round pavilion for dancing, picnic tables, and one or two other buildings not as large as the round pavilion. The latter, I think, was up the hill above the railroad, and the others were down near the creek. Before my day, I know that the young people of our church came out from Philadelphia on the trains for picnics. That was before any of us moved out there. The station was then called Alnwick Grove, but there were not many trains. This colorized lantern slide was also taken much later, in about 1916. And although it's not formally identified anywhere on the photograph that it's Alnwick Grove, I think it also gives a good idea of what the pennypack looked like in these earlier years. But I think we should take a minute to recognize that Alnwick Grove, while a popular place, may not have been the only place that the church group came to picnic and visit. And it may well have passed into history as just a country park, maybe one of several that they visited seeking respite from the summer heat. If not for the fact that in the summer of 1888, one Robert Glenn chose this area for his summer retreat, and he subsequently encouraged John Pitcairn to purchase land here. By the late 1880s, church members had begun to talk about moving the academy out of the city to a new location in the countryside. The goal clearly was to relocate not just the school, but the families and the young people who attended the schools. Their ultimate goal, therefore, was to form a new church community. It's interesting reading the letters and documents that the arguments they advanced for their move were both practical and religious in nature. On the practical side, I think the move can be understood as part of the larger national trend towards suburbanization. As you can imagine or well know, big cities were seen at the time as unattractive, unhealthy, perhaps unsafe, certainly not a good environment for children and families. As transportation improved, many Philadelphians began to commute to work in the city from new suburbs like Ardmore, Media, and others along what is now referred to as the main line. The religious reasons for moving to the countryside were at least as important, though. Academy members increasingly began to desire a distinctly new church social life, where new church families could live and their children could play together. They were clear, however, that this vision of a new church community with children playing and walking to new church schools together was quite distinct from some of the other movements of the day. Often I've had students ask, well, was this sort of like the utopian movements of the day? And I think the early church members were very clear to distinguish what they were doing from some of these other movements. I think maybe the best explanation for this is found in a New Church Life editorial from 1898. Here's just a quick quote from that. To remove the misapprehension which exists with some as to the nature of the communities in Huntington Valley, Pennsylvania, and Glenview, Illinois, it should be said that the term colony, sometimes used, does not apply. Colony, as its etymology shows, involves something of independence and self-support. Such communities have been established in the past by various sects, but rarely, if ever, have been successful. Certainly, the principles of such isolation do not exist in the cases we are considering. These are rather communities of new church persons who have removed from the city to move to the suburbs with the additional incentive of the opportunities for freer church and social life this afforded. The special occasion for the movement is the desire for the physical and moral betterment of the children, and for the opportunity to have them grow up in the church and in the sphere of new church homes, to which must be added the advantages of the opportunity of attending a new church school. But the businessmen of the community continue to conduct their businesses in the city as before, as is the case with suburbanites generally. So they wanted to make a significant point here that this community was not going to be completely isolated or seclusionary. It was not going to be self-sufficient, but it was a place for a community, a place for children to go to school, families to live together, but one that was in the world, perhaps in the world, but not of the world, as the old saying goes. So John and Gertrude Pitcairn, at the recommendation of Robert Glenn, began to look into the possibility of buying real estate out in this area near Alnwick Grove. They began to purchase land in 1889 with the acquisition of 84 acres of rolling Pennsylvania farmland and lush woods, including the Ezra Knight Farm, which is pictured here. You may well be aware that this Ezra Knight Farm became the future location of Cairnwood, Bryn Athyn Cathedral, and Glencairn. In January of 1889, John wrote to his friend Walter Childs about his recent land purchase, and I quote, "And now I have just time enough to tell you about some property I've purchased with a view of moving out of the city and as a possible location for the academy. Land in the vicinity of Philadelphia is being taken up so rapidly that Robert Glenn thought I ought to secure some. Glenn spent last summer at Beth Ayres on the Bound Brook Railroad, about 15 miles from Philadelphia, and liked the country very much. About a mile from the station on the 2nd Street Turnpike, there was a property of 35 acres for sale, which I purchased about 2 weeks ago at $600 per acre." Let me say that again, 35 acres for $600 per acre. It has a fine woods on it and is said to be the highest ground in Montgomery County and is a beautiful site for a residence. This purchased, we wanted some more, and I bought 49 acres adjoining at $350 per acre. And I still want a little more. The idea is to secure enough land for our uses and then look at other localities, and if we find anything that will suit us better, sell the land at Beth Ayres. Well, during the 1890s, while they hadn't moved out to that initial 80-some acres, the church certainly began to use it. And during the 1890s, summer services and special gatherings of the Advent Church took place in what is now Bryn Athyn here at Knight's Hill. The following is a description of a week-long June 19th celebration and meeting of the Joint Council of the General Church held on Knight's Hill in the summer of 1891. And I quote, "A charming view is afforded from this hill, which is surrounded by an undulating country filled with prosperous farms, where fields of green maize vie with the golden waving grain, while darker clumps of woodland give greater diversity to the scene. The hill is partly wooded, and among the trees on the crest of the hill a commodious tabernacle has been raised. Not far off was a dining tent, and 4 or 5 other smaller tents that clustered about the 2 larger ones helped to give the whole appearance of a camp, and reminded one forcibly of the time when in the representative churches men lived in tents and worshiped the Lord in tabernacles, on high hills and in groves. A temporary repository had been erected in the tabernacle, and was furnished with a copy of the Word, a complete set of the writings in Latin, and necessary works of reference." So after the initial purchase of 84 acres in 89, John and Gertrude continued to acquire land for the new church community and the potential academy of the new church campus, including hundreds of acres from Charles Holt, James Marsh, and other farmers in the immediate vicinity. You see some of the deeds, property deeds here. But I think it's interesting to note that the arrival of these academy members did not go unnoticed by the local residents. One young girl, the daughter actually of Charles and Mary Holt, who had sold their family farm to Pitcairn through Glen in December of 1891, wrote this in her diary. And I don't know if you can make it out here. This is the quote up here in her diary in the top left. So I sort of transcribed it here in the right. It says, "We heard that Fells have sold their place too. Christian Foster has sold his place to Glen too. These Swedenborgians are trying to buy all the place around." The site was to become Bryn Athyn, though, was not a foregone conclusion, even by this late date of 1891. Despite all of the land purchased by Pitcairn, the Academy minutes from that summer make an interesting read, to say the least, as the council took up 3 questions. The first, they asked, are we clear that a move from the city to the country is best for the Academy and its uses? Second, they asked, are we prepared to make the move? And third, they asked, what would be the proper location? There was a quick affirmative response to the first, and John Pitcairn quickly responded to the second, and I quote, "As it will probably devolve unto me to furnish a large part of the means, I will say that I see my way clear to provide about $150,000 or $200,000 for the move into the country." There's the third question that proved more challenging, however, and that is the proper location. Pitcairn was advocating for the land that he had purchased here in what would become Bryn Athyn, while his friend Walter Childs was encouraging the council to consider land near Media in Delaware County, and that's the map here on the right. Childs argued that this land in Media along the main line boasted fewer inhabitants, a great deal of water, more forest land, cheaper land, and while he admitted it was further from the city and therefore presented a bit of a challenge for those who wanted to continue to work in Philadelphia, he pointed out it included a very good train service. Should remember, as I pointed out earlier, that because the community was never intended to be self-sufficient, easy access to Philadelphia by train, regardless of where they chose to settle, as I said, was essential, both for the businessmen, but also the families who wanted to go back into the city to shop and attend cultural events. So Pitcairn admitted that Media held those certain advantages, but to him, it also included poorer soil. And this is where it gets interesting. He expressed concern over certain, how shall we say, elements of the residents there, claiming that some were, quote, averse to working, while others he described as, quote, shiftless. And I'll maybe leave you to your imagination there, expressing concerns that he would, quote, not feel safe in having children go unattended along the roads, unquote. So ultimately, Pitcairn argued in front of the council that it was a decision of population versus scenery. Do we want to settle in a place with a better population or surrounded by nicer scenery? And Robert Glenn supported that position, also describing the people out here in what would become Bryn Athyn as decent working men, thrifty and industrious. So after what reads as a spirited debate between Pitcairn and Glenn on the one hand and Childs on the other, a vote was taken in 1891, and the decision was made to move the academy schools and the community to the land that would become Bryn Athyn, here near Holmwood Grove. So it was to be here that members of the community could live together as neighbors, with their children playing together and walking to their new church schools together. So by 1892, the Pitcairns had begun construction of their home, Caronwood, on the Knight's Farm property. In that June, members of the academy gathered under this tent, stretching on the hill, down the Caronwood lawn, where they celebrated June 19th. And where they discussed, among other things, the location of where the buildings would go for their new church university. At this point, I just want to share a couple of interesting quotes from that meeting. First, John Pitcairn expressed, "I hope that another school year in the city may be our last, and that all is necessary may be done by October of next year. We all look forward to this movement with bright anticipations, but coming into closer contact may bring temptation. The trials we shall have, however, will be useful, and I hope that the closer relations into which we shall come may be the beginnings of a choir with us, and thus a preparation for life in heaven. Failure has been predicted of this movement, but we do not believe there will be failure. Principles of the Academy are to be ultimate, and we believe that the truths which we have will protect us from the errors which have caused the failures of other communities, unquote. George Starkey then rose and added, those movements had in view material ends, worldly comfort or merely moral and ethical improvement. But here we have a high and heavenly use, that of education for heaven. And that is why the movement will not fail, because it has a soul, because the Lord is in it. And no matter who falls back, it will go on. It is permanent. And so in 1893, a building committee was formed consisting of John Pitcairn, Reverend Eugene Schreck, and Robert Glenn. At the time, the only two roads on this land other than the 2nd Street Pike, which is shown here on the right. So these two dirt roads here on the right are what's now Huntington Pike, or 2nd Street Pike, and you might be able to make out, I think, the little toll house there. In addition to that, the only two roads on the land were what are today Fetters Mill Road and what is today Alden Road. And you may be able to see Alden Road running down here on the left. And I grew up here on Alden Road. And so as an Alden Road boy, I can appreciate how it was described even back then as, quote, often scored with deep ruts and gullies, unquote. Just as an aside, it seems like at the time, although different maps maybe disagree, it seems like at the time Alden Road was really mostly referred to as back road. Now some of the maps call it Mill Road, but most of them refer to it as back road, which makes a lot of sense to me because there is a path still today that runs between Alden Road and South Avenue up here at the top of the hill. And when I was growing up, we all mistakenly referred to it as the Black Path. But I guess it makes sense if it was really the back path that ran from back road up to what was going to become the loop. Well, back to the story. So the building committee in 1893 sort of led the development of several different versions of a plan for the settlement. And this one was drawn up by the nationally renowned landscape architecture firm of Olmsted, and Elliott. You're probably familiar that most of the landscaping work was done by Elliott, but stamped as part of the work of the firm Olmsted, and Elliott. So looking at this plan, I think it's interesting to note that the original plans had the academy located here, actually on the west side of the pike, where the cathedral now stands. And as we all know, the academy was ultimately moved to the east side of the pike. We'll get back to that in a minute. And the argument goes, as far as I'm aware, that a lot of that was due to the eastern side of the pike having a lot flatter land for athletic fields. But I think it's also interesting to note the number of full-size property lots. In this plan has 80 plots for individual residents. And look how they're arranged along this elegant sort of non-linear road system. Some of the roads may look familiar to you, others not. Clearly, many of these roads were never built. But yes, this plan by Olmsted, and Elliott marks the origin of the roads that now make up what we affectionately refer to as the loop. So what was then called Central Avenue here, which was then, then called Central Avenue, now called Alnwick, which curved past what was the Lesher Farm, and then South Avenue here, which had what was called the Marsh Farm that sloped down here to Alden Road, or maybe Mill Road on this map. So these roads joined at what is today known as Station Hill here on the right, where they ran down to the station and the bridge over Pennypack Creek. On the left, you see a planting plan by Elliott, which has survived today, and That plan specifies exactly which variety of trees lined the roads, including the now mature maples, some of which still survive on the loop. So in June of that year, in June of 1893, the official announcement of the move of the country was made in New Church Life. It read, "The Academy of the new church has decided to remove its Philadelphia schools, its library, its publication office and book room, and some of its general offices from Philadelphia to the place in the country situated about 18 miles from the present location in the city. 4 buildings are being erected: a university building, which will accommodate the various uses of the academy, a residence for the chancellor, and 2 houses for non-resident students, 1 for each sex. Some of the families connected with the academy and its uses intend to settle in the vicinity of the university." It's interesting. So this plan, here's the school here, the library. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but the library sort of on the front of the school, a chancellor's house out here, sort of right at Cathedral Road and the Pike, the girls' dormitory and the boys' dormitory. In fact, I've seen another plan which had the boys' dormitory not here, but all the way down at the bottom of Sleepy Hollow Hill, about as far away from the girls' dorm as you possibly could have gotten. But again, back to the story. While they announced that move in 1893, that announcement was sadly premature, as it coincided with an event you may be familiar with, and that was the financial panic of 1893. But while the move did not begin in earnest for 2 more years as a result of that panic, a few houses, in addition to Caronwood here on the left, had begun to be built. The Starkey House was the first actually to be occupied in what is now Bryn Athyn in 1894, and work had already begun on the Potts House on Alnwick, and the Robert Glenn home, seen in this colorized lantern slide on the right. This is a later photo from 1914, but this colorized photo shows Glenhurst with the photo, the home of Robert Glenn. So when the school year began in the fall of 1894, the school was divided. Think of that. Fall of 1894. Some families had already started moving out here. The full move was delayed for a few years. So when school began in the fall of 1894, the school itself was divided, 1 still in Philadelphia and 1 in the country. And it's incredible to think that some teachers actually taught in both locations, taking the train out to the country to teach for part of the day and back to the city to teach for the other. By the following school year, in October of 1895, the community had built the clubhouse, shown here. This had been built on Central Avenue, now on Alnwick Road, to serve as the church, the school, and a community center. A description of the clubhouse appears in New Church Life in 1895, and I read, quote, "The interior is entirely finished in Virginia pine, ceiling and walls being alike covered with this beautiful wood. The furniture of the chancel is of the noble California redwood. The chancel, which measures 10 by 15.5 feet, is lit by a window in the roof, the light being shaded from the congregation by an ornamental tent-like contrivance of wood that rises in the form of a Japanese roof and meets the ceiling in front of the window. The auditorium measures 35 by 35 feet, giving more commodious, there's that word commodious again, commodious accommodation for the worshipers than we have had in the city. Where the hall of worship was so crowded as to be often uncomfortable, the auditorium will be transformed into schoolrooms by movable partitions." However, with the move to the country complete by 1897, the school had already outgrown the clubhouse after just 2 years. And by the spring of 1898, this large frame building was built nearby at the convergence of Central Avenue or Alnwick Road and South Avenue, sort of where Bishop and Mrs. Klein's house sits today. First used as a schoolhouse, this building would later become known as the Inn. and every possible effort was made to attract students from New Church families who lived at a distance, regardless of their financial situation. And I quote, "In order to enable the largest possible number of children to attend, arrangements have been made to provide table board at $3.50 a week. Rooms will be furnished free in cases where parents are unable to pay for the same. The terms of tuition are $50 for the school year, but special arrangements may be made." And now to the beginning of the story of the municipal borough. So in April of that year, and we're talking about 1898, property owners in the community met and voted to form a village association. Now, you got to remember, this community forming here was officially in the municipal township of Moreland, which today sort of Upper Moreland, Lower Moreland. But the property owners here in this New Church community met and voted to form sort of a voluntary organization outside of that known as the Village Association. And they articulated that the purpose for this voluntary association was for, among other things, one, maintaining their roads, which they argued were not being done properly by the township, maintaining the windmill-driven waterworks, the water supply and drainage systems, and the burial ground. And they say very clearly that the reason that it was important to them to form this association to provide support for these was that they did not think it was fair to leave the entire financial burden to John Pitcairn. When this association was formed, however, the passing of the articles of the association did not go without protest. It was interesting that one resident stated that they were going about it backwards. He dissented, arguing that they should be working and not organizing. He argued that a country does not begin with a constitution, but it begins by working. Despite his protest, the articles passed and a board of control was established. Looking at this photo of an early photo of the loop, I think it's interesting that among the first actions of the board of control of the Village Association were, one, a request that property owners keep the grass cut in front of their respective properties. Two, that all property owners should agree to share in the expense of maintaining the roads, the surface drainage, the sanitary sewers in proportion to the assessed values of their property. And three, that all property owners should agree to a toll of 5 cents a ton on all coal hauled over the community's roads. With regard to the roads, I think it's interesting to note in the meeting the following year, a Mr. Deering, quote, called attention to the objectionable habit of many of the children playing with the fine stone dust on the roads as if they were at the seashore, to the detriment of the roadbed. I looked as hard as I could, but I could not find a photo in our archives of children playing here in the street as if they were at the seashore. It's also interesting, I think, that the president felt that, and he apparently felt pretty strongly, that all the trees on the properties along the loop here, that all the trees should be trimmed by one man, because he argued if each attended to the trees in front of his own property, the general effect could not help but be bad. So again, I just want to point out that these self-imposed taxes to take care of these matters were in addition to the involuntary taxes these residents were already paying to the Moreland Township and Montgomery County. But most pressing for the Village Association and the residents of the community was the need for a formal name for the settlement. This formal name was considered an important first step in securing their own railroad station, their own telegraph office, and eventually their own post office, as well as giving the community what they described as a feeling of stability. The question of a name for the settlement would prove most challenging, however, with the debate raging for over a year. Now, I'm sure many of you are familiar with some of the names that were under consideration, but I thought it might be fun this evening just to quickly summarize some of the results of the vote. So first came up at a special meeting of the Village Association on September 10th, 1898, and the association met with members of the congregation to consider a name, and these were the original 22 names that were suggested here on the first ballot. Let's see, Allendale, Brynmont, a popular one down there at bottom, Rothlin, Ridgemont. But you can see in the first ballot, by far the most popular was Hillcrest, receiving 19 votes. So after this initial vote, they eliminated half of them. The lower half were knocked out, and they had a vote with the remaining 11. And again, Hillcrest was the big leader with 19. But Rothlin crept up there for a tie. So Rothlin was also had 19 votes. So after this, the list was reduced in half again, and here was the result on the third ballot. Suddenly, Gwynmont took the lead with 14, Hillcrest with 13, and then a fourth ballot was taken, and Gwynmont was the clear leader with 30. So the answer was the new community was named Gwynmont, right? And here we are talking at Gwynmont College. Okay, maybe not. But they actually did take a fifth ballot, and after that, they decided to adjourn for 1 month without taking a final action. Behind the scenes, though, Bishop W.F. Pendleton met with a Mr. Hicks, who was a Welshman, and they decided that they needed to give a little more time to the study of the question of a name, feeling that the settlement needed a name with a more significant meaning than any of the ones offered previously. And they consulted with this dictionary here on the slide. And this is where they first began to consider names like Bryn and Athyn. So at the next meeting on February 18th, the Committee on a Name, influenced by Bishop Pendleton, offered the following nominations. And this is where Bryn Athyn appears for the first time. So here are the names down here on the left-hand side with their meaning. And this, you can see the handwritten minutes from the Village Association on the right. And you can see the first choice here of this vote was Ninmont. And I had some fun conversations with some friends about some names, potential names for the athletic teams of Bryn Athyn College, if it actually was Ninmont College, but maybe we'll leave that for another day. I should mention that two other names were proposed from the floor. One person suggested Swedenborg as a name for the town, and another suggested Manoli. Anyway, Ninmont came out with 6 and Bryn Athyn as the top second choice. Well, on May 1st, the committee came back and abruptly changed course and submitted the name Hillbrook to the association on the basis that it was descriptive, simple, and not in use anywhere in the United States. So while Hillbrook was formally adopted, as you can see from the result of the vote on May 1st, as the name of the settlement, and by the way, it won by a vote of 8-2 over Gwynmont, as you can see here. The name Hillbrook lasted only 3.5 months. By August, John Pitcairn recommended that the name be reconsidered in light of the number of objections to it within the community. And in September, Pitcairn moved that the name Bryn Athyn be formally adopted, claiming that 3/4 actually preferred the name Bryn Athyn and that he did not feel it useful to continue the discussion, thinking, quote, that the discussion was a waste of brain power, unquote. His motion was carried by a vote of 6-3. And so the community finally had a name, and soon its desired train station, as the Alnwick Grove station was changed to Bryn Athyn Station, with the station building, which now serves as the Bryn Athyn Post Office down here on the left, later constructed in 1902. 2 years later, after Bryn Athyn received its name, construction began on a revised version of the original 1893 plan for the Academy campus, as noted earlier, on the east side of Huntington Pike. I want to take a quick minute to point out some of these buildings, as you well know them. So Benaid Hall was built in 1901, finishing touches and dedication in 1902, which housed the church, the college, the secondary schools. Glen Hall, built the same year, although it was occupied by the boys until 1904 when Stewart Hall was constructed. Maybe you can pick out Glen Hall and Stewart Hall. Glen Hall here, right? Stewart Hall over here. The dining hall and heating plant were also built in 1904. In 1909, work began on a combined library and museum building, now the Fine Arts Building here on the left, and the elementary school, which is now DeCharms Hall. Just want to read two quick quotes from New Church Life from 1901. To those who know the academy schools at Friedlander Street down in Philadelphia, the doubt occurs. Can all this be meant for us? No, not for us, but for the most glorious use in the wide, wide world. Nothing can be too good for it. And a second quote in 1902, the roads have finally been finished and the grounds round about have been leveled and sown with grass, so that the whole campus now has the appearance of an immense, neatly kept lawn. Trees and shrubs will be put in to break the monotony of the wide expanse, and vines to trail up the rocky walls of the great building. It looms up like an errand prophecy upon the horizon. What a beauty it will present a few years hence. But to conclude the story, by 1915, the growing community had beautiful new school buildings. As we noted, a village association to manage much of their municipal affairs. And yet, not yet noted, the Bryn Athyn Cathedral was beginning to rise from the ground. The community, however, was also feeling burdened by its double taxation. As we mentioned, the involuntary tax levied by Moreland Township, from which the community seemingly received little benefit, and the voluntary tax levied in the form of contributions to the village association. And so in 1915, residents of Bryn Athyn petitioned Montgomery County for incorporation of the village into a borough. The petition, though, was met with strong resistance by some within Moreland Township. As we read in New Church Life, the church once more has had the experience of being dragged into court. Bryn Athyn is trying to incorporate as a borough into the laws of Pennsylvania, but the petition was opposed by some of our neighbors. At the trial, we were surprised and amused to find how much our friends in the surrounding villages and in the township at large would miss us, or our contributions to the road and school taxes. Our case is now before the court, but the outcome as yet uncertain. Indeed, the petition was opposed partly on the grounds that, one, Bryn Athyn was a religious colony that sought religious seclusion, and two, allowing Bryn Athyn to incorporate as a separate borough would reduce the revenue of Moreland Township by roughly $380,000 in taxes annually. A reading of the legal brief prepared in part by Raymond Pitcairn provides useful insight into the reasons why the residents of Bryn Athyn felt that a distinct incorporated borough was justified. We are organized for the purpose of an educational community, and all who live there, I won't say all, but the majority, many, are interested in that development. Princeton began the same way. We are yet small, but we hope to develop into a university town. Maybe we should read that last sentence again. We are yet small, but we hope to develop into a university town. So it's interesting, some of the reasons included in the brief were that the freeholders had formed themselves into this Bryn Athyn Village Association for the economic, efficient, and beautiful development of Bryn Athyn, including the streets, trees, shrubs, paths, sidewalks, water supply, sewage disposal. Yes, they did have sewers. Surface drainage, and other civic improvements. The town plan itself, they argued, was not built along the turnpike like Huntington Valley or Beth Ayres, and that they argued that they were separated from Huntington Valley and Beth Ayres by intervening farmland. They argued that their civic organizations and very uses were that of a college town, which clearly distinguished Bryn Athyn from Huntington Valley and Beth Ayres, and they noted that Bryn Athyn was a growing town. They noted the recent completion of Quarry Road. They argued they were about to build North Avenue, as you well know was never built, that they were in the middle of building a church which would accommodate 1,000 people, noted they had a power plant with a capacity for 4 times the present need, and noted that the population had increased over 200% since 1900. They also noted the justification for taxes with the supporting evidence as follows: the need to support the roads, the sewer plant, the system and surface drainage, fire protection, police protection, street lighting. They noted that the plans for future lot development showed careful and competent town planning. They noted that in addition to roads and pathways, the properties were connected by 3 alleyways. We noted the back path, and the one that's still there between South Avenue and Central Avenue. I can never remember what it's called. Maybe the crossover? Can't quite remember. They also noted that the landscaping development included plantings by the well-known firm Olmsted and Elliott. They also noted the existence of sidewalks on both sides of most of the roads. Now, I found it interesting, the box here in the archives that has the trial materials included some photos of some homes, and I just thought you might like to see that. This is what was the C.R. Pendleton house. I'm not sure which piece of the argument they were trying to support with this. This is now Nolene Rose's house. This, which was marked the Oedner's house, and I'm hoping if anyone's still logged on at the end of this, that maybe they can give me some hint as to where this house is. I have to admit, I've been stumped. Maybe this is here to show the sidewalks. The house by the heating plant, which is different now, sort of a more modern flat-roofed house. And this great shot, this shows Alden Road down here, and this house here is where the current CNS Club is, and these are the homes along South Avenue. Here's that back path. So the following year, beginning of 1916, Judge Aaron Schwartz decided in favor of the Bryn Athyn petition, rejecting the contention that the purpose of the incorporation seems to be to establish religious seclusion, and that such a person is against the policy of law, and so granted Bryn Athyn incorporation as a borough on February 8th, 1916. February 8th, 1916. A couple of quick quotes from his ruling. No doubt Mr. Pitcairn and most of his associates purchased and improved this territory with the view of establishing homes, schools, and a church where they could live in comfortable surroundings and worship God in accordance with their faith and practices. That they are good, law-abiding citizens is not disputed by anyone. In morality and intelligence, they compare favorably with the best people of the country. It is not even suggested that the teachings or purposes of this church are prohibited by statute or common law, for it is pretended that its teachings are, nor is it pretended that its teachings are detrimental to the public or to the neighborhood. The Swedenborgian faith of Mr. Pitcairn and his associates may have been the cause, in part at least, for the development of this village settlement, but if the cause or purpose was not unlawful, then we cannot reject or overlook the conditions that followed therefrom and now confront us. If the statutory requirements for the incorporation are present, the demand for the borough should prevail. And lastly, and here you see a handwritten copy of his ruling here on the right. Why should the petitioners who purchased the unimproved grounds in the township, who turned them into a beautiful settlement, and who paid the expenses out of their own pockets, be denied a municipal organization whereby they can better promote the interests, comforts, and convenience of their home? It is their settlement, with all its homes, comforts, and conveniences. The church, the library, the school, the campus, the streets, the houses are all the creations of their hands. A borough in which the majority of the residents are Swedenborgians does not, of necessity, show religious seclusion. So Felix Barricky, shown here, was sworn in as Bryn Athyn's first burgess on March 21st, a little more than a month after the judge's ruling. And 1 week later, Borough Council held its first meeting, during which Barricky swore in 7 elected members of Borough Council. I thought it might be fun to end with just a couple of slides from that year. Bryn Athyn celebrated its incorporation, as you can see, with a grand 4th of July celebration that year. The bulletin of the Sons of the Academy recounts, this year the parade broke all records and included numerous children, flags, and baby coaches, a cannon, a battleship, the local fire engine, a big drum, a little drum, and a bugle. All branches of the service were represented by the costumed children, Army, Navy, Cavalry, Artillery, and the Medical Corps. It was not all celebration, however. Sadly, John Pitcairn died on July 22nd, 1916, at the age of 75, just a few months after the official incorporation of Bryn Athyn as a borough. the culmination of that dream that began 42 years earlier. Coincidentally, the Garden Atlantic restaurant here on the left, where Pittsburgh where Pitcairn had formed the new church club back in Pittsburgh on January 12th, 1874, and thereby planted the seeds that would grow into the borough of Bryn Athyn, was torn down the very same day that John Pitcairn passed away. So I know our time is short, and I've rambled on for a long time, but I just have two reflections for our lessons today. When I think back on this story, I think the most compelling point, the most important lesson for me is just the vision, the passion, the sacrifice that was made to build this community. Here we are, at least those of us who are here in Bryn Athyn, to build this community for the very purpose of new church education. The idea that to have a community where people could live together, children could grow up together, they could walk to school together, they could play together, they could worship together, but really that at the center of that was a school. Their vision of a new church university. This idea that new church education, from that very first meeting of those 4 men at lunch, it was because they believed that the General Convention had ignored education, and that education was vital in the future of the church. And that is why they formed the Academy movement, and that's why they envisioned this move out to the countryside and ultimately to Bryn Athyn. But I think a second is the key point in Judge Schwartz's ruling, and that is that in arguing that this community could also be a municipal borough, one of his arguments is that this was not a seclusionary community. I read that quote early on, talking from the founders, that this wasn't a utopian community that was cut off, it wasn't self-sufficient, that this was going to be a community, yes, religious in focus, but also one in the world. Hopefully not of the world, but in the world. This idea that this community with the church and the academy, a new church education at its center, would also interact with the world, and that we would work out in the world and commute and interact with the larger world. And so I think those are 2 points that stick with me: the vision and passion for creating a new church community with education at its core, and also the idea that it is not a community of isolation. So those are the words I had for you tonight. I would share with you that we have just launched an exhibition sharing the story here at Glencairn Museum. This exhibition in the apse is going to be open through Charter Day. So if you live out of town, but you happen to be in Bryn Athyn at Charter Day, you'll get a chance to see it. And so I think I'll close it down there, and I'll just leave you, as long as this screen is up, with a little timeline, if that helps anybody. So thank you for your attention. I appreciate you listening to the story, and I hope that you will reflect yourself on sort of what the meaning is to you. Why the founding of Bryn Athyn, both as a community and also as a borough, is relevant to our lives today. All right, Amanda, I think I'll send it back to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Brian. That was a wonderful presentation. So we are coming up on 8:30, so unfortunately it doesn't seem like we have time for questions this evening. But before we sign off for the night, I just wanted to invite all of our alumni to join us for another virtual presentation next week on Tuesday, May 10th at 11 a.m. John King will be talking about corporate social responsibility at that time. So thank you, Brian, so much for that presentation. We're getting a lot of great feedback already on the app, and I'm sure all the alumni that joined in tonight enjoyed it. So thank you again.
Well, thank you, everyone, and thank you, Amanda.
Have a nice night, everyone.
Good night.